Thank you guys so much for joining us. My name is Rumbi. I'm an associate editor here at Devex, and thank you for joining us for this conversation where we're seeking to understand a little bit more the links between conflict and food security. Today, I'm joined by some pretty knowledgeable guests on this topic, and we have Luqman, Executive Director for Food for Humanity, Yasin Farjad, Emergency Quality Program Manager from Concern Worldwide in Afghanistan, as well as Laetitia from Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me. So just to kick off the conversation, Yasin, Concern Worldwide co-published the Global Hunger Index last year, and there was a specific focus on conflict and hunger. What were some of the links that you found between conflict and hunger, and what are some of the links that you're sort of experiencing, like in Afghanistan?
Okay, thank you. Actually, the conflict in Afghanistan has a very long route, and there is like 40 years of war in Afghanistan. Started with Russian invasion and continued for the control of power in Afghanistan. So conflict is as many effects to the hunger and food insecurity. For example, during this wartime, there was issue of access to the conflict zone, conflict areas, and also there was sanctions which was preventing the poor people to access to the food. And also issue of like with war, there is also like issue of there is no work or opportunity for the people. There is the issue of that people cannot afford to buy the food, and affordability is another like issue, and it is also coupled with this climatical change and lack of like rain in the most of rain-fed area in Afghanistan. So because of this, conflict is the biggest issue for access to the food.
Okay. And in your case, Muna, you're working in Yemen, and this is really a conflict that people are saying this is really food crisis that people are saying has been driven by the war. What are some of the links that you're experiencing there?
Well, thank you, first of all. And I think it's really devastating to see that the extent of violence that is related to food insecurity in Yemen. And I think it's getting worse by the minute. We do have a truce right now, which is something that we're looking cautiously optimistic for, but still the effects of the Russian war, the prices rocketing up, and people already cannot stand more external or internal shocks. Yemen's the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and we keep saying that it's on a brink of famine, but we're already, as humanitarians, seeing the famine in many villages and areas in Yemen. The people, for instance, rely on imported goods and humanitarian aid. So 90% is imported from outside, and the private sector is in a crisis because they're also facing major challenges, and the people have not had salaries for many years. So the vulnerability that the people are facing is very high, and and no matter how much aid is coming into Yemen, we're still facing difficulties such as, I mean, it's getting up to more than 16 to 17 at least million people who are not able to feed their families. So this is how bad it is.
Yasin mentioned earlier access issues in Afghanistan, and Laetitia, I found this very interesting about Ethiopia, a situation where there's a deliberate attempt or deliberate effort to block access to humanitarian relief. And recently, Human Rights Watch, alongside Amnesty, published a report on this. Can you take us through a little bit of your findings in terms of aid and access and how that has affected people in Ethiopia?
Yes, thank you very much for having us on. I mean, in many ways, the context in Ethiopia in the last 16 to 17 months would require a lot of lessons learned in terms of how much both the aid sector, but also food in particular, has been used and has been central to warring parties' actions and efforts to inflict harm on civilians. So, as you mentioned, in the Tigray region in particular, for 10 months now, we are speaking about an effective siege being in place. And this is the result both due to stringent restrictions on humanitarian access, but also the cutting off of services. In Tigray, there has been no electricity in that period. There has been no internet since the start of the conflict in November 2020. There's been no banking service in place. So this is all contributing to pushing over the edge even segments of the community, middle class individuals who were civil servants, who potentially could have survived some of the other shocks, but were not as a result of these restrictions on services. Now, I do think Ethiopia is also a very strong example, and again, where a whole lessons learned exercise needs to happen, looking at how the aid sector and what we had seen over the years of an increasingly development oriented approach, focus, a very specific relationship with the government, also contributed to the humanitarian side of the aid sector in some ways losing their independence. And this had an impact very early on in their ability to pivot when the conflict started towards a humanitarian response, which required obviously a very different relationship with the government, which was now a warring party, which required a very different human resource capacity on the ground, but also made them, the sector, very vulnerable to what would be the deliberate obstruction on humanitarian scale up in many ways. A whole range of bureaucratic measures were put in place, in addition to very real physical obstructions, intimidations, attacks on humanitarians. Many humanitarians were killed in the first 9 months of the conflict, and many of those killings have not been significantly or in any way investigated. Now, what we've been looking at is the context in one particular part of Tigray, in Western Tigray, which very early on in the conflict was taken over by the Amhara authorities from the region of the Amhara region. And what we've documented is from November 2020 through to date, the authorities there, the new administrations, the new security forces that took over that part of Tigray, conducted a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Tigrayans who were living there. And why this is important to the discussion today is, first of all, when decisions were made around food actors and who took responsibilities for distributions in certain parts of Tigray in November 2020, this area, which has been a contested area for decades, fell under the government distribution system. And what our report found was that the little aid, the little food assistance which was going in, was being deliberately restricted from the Tigrayan population, which was one of the many measures which contributed to this ethnic cleansing campaign. So really a casebook example of ethnic cleansing and of instrumentalization of food assistance.
So you mentioned that Ethiopia is a very strong example, and I find it the same way. And there was this deliberate obstruction and manipulation of aid. Yasin and Muna, have you seen this happening in the areas where you work as well? I'll start with you, Muna.
Yes, definitely. I think one of the major problems in Yemen was the obstruction of aid. It has been used by warring parties, in particular in Sana'a-controlled areas by the Houthis, where the aid has been used to mobilize fighters in the battlefields, and that was something devastating. While our children were, starving from. And I think another issue was also the access. I want to add to what my colleagues are saying about the access. I think it's also a big issue in Yemen, because many parts of Yemen are under a siege. internally also. And we only hear about the borders and the seaports and all of that, but we don't hear about the siege inside Yemen. For instance, Taz has been under a siege for the past 7 years, nearly 8 years right now, where nearly 3 million people are under a siege, and they don't, and it's very difficult to bring in food, water, or medicine or aid. And we faced a devastating situation during COVID-19, where we're not able to support the hospitals effectively. Another issue in Yemen, which is, I think, the major issue, is the economic instability, and so that there are many factors to that. The depreciation of the Yemeni rial. There are two banks in Yemen, and they are not unified, and so that is also causing major problems for the financial institutions in Yemen, and insufficient liquidity and all of that. And then we also have the financial isolation, while it's very difficult to work with the international community because of the risks with the international banks. There's also other major issues, such as related also to accessibility. We are finding some sort of breakthrough right now, but it's very little. However, we might have the reopening of the Sana'a airport, which is also under a lot of conditions. But the bans on the banknotes, the access to airports and seaports and major roads in Yemen, which are used for food access, all of the restrictions on fuel and food imports from Hodeidah and other ports. The one of the additional challenges is the dual customs and the duties and taxes that are also putting a big burden on the private sector in particular, and humanitarian organizations. Humanitarian organizations are also facing a very closing and challenging and risky space to operate. So it's a major it's a devastating issue on all fronts. Right now, more focus has been on the economy, but we haven't seen anything yet. But there is more. I think the last 2 weeks there have been talks, and there have been more dialogues. There has been the Yemeni talks in the Gulf states, and I think that was led by the GCC. The UN-led peace process is also trying to find some sort of breakthrough after 8 years of nearly 8 years of stalemate. These two major talks right now and tracks on the peace front are really our only hope and last chance to revive the economy and try to find a more sustainable way of alleviating the suffering, because the people right now, without their salaries, with the loss of their livelihoods, have just turned into either depending on aid completely, or joining the battlefields where they might get some income, and this is driving the violence even further. So we really want to focus right now on the immediate humanitarian relief, which must continue, but we also need to look at reviving the economy, the livelihoods, and bringing Yemen back at least to some sort of stability in the coming few months.
Thanks so much for that, Muna. There's so much that I want to build up on. You spoke about solutions, and we'll get back to that in a little while. But Yasin, I just wanted to check with you if you've also witnessed sort of these deliberate obstructions as well in Afghanistan.
Actually, Afghanistan is experiencing a very bad food insecurity. Like 24 million of Afghans are now have lack of access to food. And it is also like the severity of this crisis is compounded by economic sanction placed to Afghanistan after this new government changed in August 2021. These authorities that now come into power, they do not understand the context of humanitarian. So sometimes they are pushing to give the list of people to include into the aid list, which is like aid agencies are not doing that. But in general, there are like issues that they are trying to sideline and bring the aid for their fellows. And Afghanistan economy has a very big problem, and the government is unable, not recognized actually internationally as well as like locally. There are still small conflicts going in some places, but in some places which is like Panjshir in a province in Afghanistan, there was like deliberate stop of food going there, but actually it is solved after negotiations. But in our area where concern is working, we have small issues, but we are negotiating and they are understanding and allowing it to go to the right people and genuine people. Thank you.
Thank you. And Muna, you alluded to this earlier. The relationship between conflict and food insecurity is kind of a cycle, in the sense that conflict breeds hunger, but at the same time, when there's food insecurity, it sort of leads to conflict. How can we start to break the cycle and sort of address the issue? I know that food aid is an immediate solution, but it can't be a long-term solution. So how can we sort of start to break this cycle?
Exactly. I think that the people need more dignified solutions in Yemen long term. I must say that the dramatic levels of food insecurity in Yemen and the threat of famine are the result of years of war. And even before the war, we already had high levels of pre existing famine and a food crisis in general. And I also want to say that this is entirely man made. And the war has made it worse, but the dependency on aid is also contributing, I personally believe, to the conflict, because right now we are creating this dependency and leaving so many other entities and livelihoods without any support. So I think that a dignified approach to Yemen, a whole reconstructing of the humanitarian operations in Yemen is needed immediately. And I hope that to see that this is going to happen very soon. The UN organizations, with all due respect, and we appreciate all their work, but they need to be more flexible in their mandate so that they are able to attend and respond effectively, because the livelihood projects that are needed in Yemen could definitely reduce much of the violence. And I say this by seeing actually many of the projects that have contributed to peace in Yemen were because they supported many livelihoods on agriculture, fisheries, and people started to work together and started to reduce the violence over land, water, and natural resources and livelihoods. So I think this is a major recommendation that is immediately needed. I also think that the lack of accountability, diversion, and obstruction of aid, all of this need immediate attention, and to really establish monitoring mechanisms that can support a better approach and a better response to humanitarian aid in Yemen. Now, we also need to really think about the economy in a more serious matter and bring it up to the highest priority. And I believe that a multi-stakeholder approach, which really involves the youth, the civil society, the private sector, the women, and the local communities, is also very important. We cannot just rely on this isolated approach of the international organizations bringing some aid into Yemen, working on their own islands without the real community. It's not sustainable, it's not efficient. The local communities have access, they have the ability, and they cannot also work alone. Neither the local community can work on their own or the international organization. So I really think this would be of added value. We saw it during COVID-19. how the private sector led a very good initiative with the UN and other organizations. These kind of approaches are more sustainable in Yemen, but nothing will help the Yemeni people without stopping the war. So the most imperative step would be to end this devastating and bloody war in Yemen, and lift all the restrictions that have really put the Yemeni people in a dire situation. Yeah, I will stop there, and I just want to add that a comprehensive humanitarian approach, which involves the local community and supports the economy and supports the institutionalizing of the government, and that would really be the main recommendation that I would come out from here.
Comprehensive humanitarian report. And Muna also spoke about flexibility within the UN, which brings me to something that you said, Laetitia, earlier on. You spoke about the relationship between the government and humanitarians and the need to pivot when the government became one of the warring factions. So what exactly should humanitarians in Ethiopia be doing now, considering that we're at a point where we're at a ceasefire? Humanitarian aid has just gone into Tigray region. What should they be doing to ensure that there isn't this sort of like deliberate manipulation of aid, and that everyone who needs assistance is actually getting that assistance?
Thank you. I do want to come back to the question you just posed, Muna, and the link between conflict and breeding of hunger, because I do think it is important to underline that, of course, there are obligations of warring parties. And what we have seen in the conflict in Ethiopia since the beginning has been the deliberate attack on people's means of survival. And that has been both widespread pillaging, looting. In our report that we've just released with Amnesty International, one of the key reasons why hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans were coerced to leave Western Tigray was the pillaging, looting, taking over of their means of survival. This is a very fertile area. And so I think it is important to continue to underline that this should not be happening. And as Muna says, if there is ongoing impunity for these tactics of warfare, we are in a situation when you then have a community which becomes dependent on assistance. And this is exactly what we have seen in Tigray in particular, I would say, but it could be extrapolated to other parts of the conflict affected areas, is where you cut off services, where you loot and pillage people's means of survivals, where you have had attacks on farmers in periods where there could have been positive harvests. All this sends a message. And then at the same time, as we know, access can be turned on and off. That tap, and this is where the international community has been for the last 10 months counting trucks, instead of looking at a bigger picture where there have been a whole range of instruments used to make a community dependent on those trucks, which can come in and out. And as you say, yes, there have been a handful of trucks which have come in the last few weeks. But again, as humanitarians themselves underline, even if there was widespread access to the region, there needs to be commercial activity that needs to start again. Markets need to start again. Services need to start to be able to deal with the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis we are dealing with here. So, I mean, in terms of lessons learned, it's very clear that in a context, and as an organization, we have documented the instrumentalization of development assistance in Ethiopia for many years. Over a decade ago, we put out a number of reports which highlighted not only how assistance was being instrumentalized by the then coalition in power, the EPRDF, in terms of repressing the population, but also how development actors had failed to put in place the oversight mechanisms which were so critical in a context where aid could be instrumentalized. And so, coming to your question around the current context, again, in discussions, in a context where aid has been instrumentalized, where just in the last few years, we've also seen assistance being used to force millions of internally displaced people in Ethiopia home as well, it is key for the aid sector to maintain a bargaining power in the relationship that they have with the government, and especially, of course, when the government becomes a warring party. And this is where, in terms of Western Tigray, but more broadly, we are calling and really underlying that, yes, obviously, food is critical right now, but you need a protection-led response. You need, throughout the response, even if food is maybe the most pressing need, although medication for Tigray right now is essential as well, protection needs to be put in place throughout. And when I say protection, I'm also talking about the monitoring mechanisms, the oversight mechanisms to make sure that food is not ending up in the hands of soldiers, of forces, and also being used to, as we've documented in Western Tigray, commit what we have characterized as crimes against humanity.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to to my final question, and we are slowly running out of time. This has been really interesting, but you alluded to it, Laetitia. We're talking about resilience and sort of having like these structures in place. And looking long term, it seems the solution, and you say this in terms of Yemen, Muna, would be peace building. We need to look at how we can build peace within the country. It's been an 8-year conflict. We need to look at how we can build peace within the country. But with regards to that, how then do you incorporate or integrate peace building in the creation of resilient food systems? What should we be looking at as we're building? I'll pass that question on to you, Yasin, and then I'll just ask all of you to just weigh in on that.
Okay, thank you for the question. Actually, we have like experience that when we are implementing projects, we need to implement the conflict sensitivity approach to understand what is like the cause of the conflict in a local area. Our experience with development project, particularly this livelihood like programs, we started like bring 40 community together to build a watershed area. And because of good participation and also sensitization of like the program and also responding to their need, with their participation, we established sort of committees and groups from various like community, including like women to participate into projects. So because of that type of like programs, lots of conflict reduced in one of the districts that we are working. And a bigger picture, it is also like required to negotiate about the importance of aid and also about the like causes of anger with the authorities to reduce this effect. I think with conflict sensitivity approach, we can achieve more because we will understand the causes of conflict, and we are avoiding anything which is creating more conflict. So with this, we understand the root causes and reduces the negative effect. With participation, the ownership ultimately goes to the people, so it goes to for a longer sustainability of the program to address the longer term poverty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasin. And Muna, we literally have 3 minutes left. So in a minute, how can we build that resilience?
But I think both of you already answered that question, but supporting the resilience of the people. But we also need to look into, like Yasin, he said that about the drivers of the conflict. One of the drivers of the conflict, for instance, in Yemen is the fragility and the fractions in Yemen. And I think that that needs a real focus on a transformative peace process that also includes the security sector reform, brings together the military, the police, the justice, the civil society, the humanitarian organizations, the private sector all together. Because what we've seen over the past few years is a very exclusive approach to peace building. This has really developed the violence in Yemen, and inclusivity is the major need for Yemen right now. And I think right now we, like I said, last month we had quite a breakthrough. We have a new presidential council, which is, we hope, going to bring in some sort of inclusivity, but it's not enough. we still need to work through a localized approach to the peace process with a gendered lens. We also need to have a holistic approach to food security and invest in a long-term vision for the country. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Laetitia, any other recommendations you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, just coming to Yasin's point on root causes, what's very clear in Ethiopia and something we've been underlining even before this conflict is that there have been cycles of impunity which have led to many grievances. And in a country which has now been in many ways divided, where there have been so many harm amongst communities and by the government towards communities, ensuring those grievances have channels where they can be aired, where those voices can be heard, and really ensuring that this cycle of impunity, and that means both obviously formal accountability for those responsible for the worst crimes in positions of command responsibility, but also obviously creating structures and systems so that there can be discussions around truth, around reconciliation. And it's essential now for all actors who are involved in potentially some sort of peace negotiations going forward, that these questions are central to the agenda going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about, and this is an issue that our reporters have been following and will continue to follow. And we look forward to reading more of your work and engaging more on these issues. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.